How's it going, guys? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. This is PSReady, my channel all about PlayStation, and you guessed it, in today's video I have 3 topics to cover. Starting out with PS3 emulation is getting realer than ever. Second on the list, here's the craziest way you can actually get a free PS5. And third, I'm just gonna say it might be time for Sony to buy Arrowhead. All right, let's jump into the first topic here, because this is exciting. We've been talking a lot going into the end of 2024 and I guess the beginning of 2025 about PS3 emulation. This has been weirdly coming up a lot because there was that news story where someone said, oh, the PS5 is more than capable of running PS3 games because they were able to get the PS5's APU, but like to work as a Windows computer on a motherboard with RAM and a graphics card. They were like, it's more than capable of running PS3 games. And Sony spent a lot of last year working with a new company called Implicit Conversions to make a new emulator for PS1, PS2, and PSP games that, while still needs some work, was a genuine improvement over the emulator they were using on the PS5, where it was the PS4 version of the emulator emulating old console games being emulated by the PS5, and those layers of emulation caused weird breakdowns in frame rate and frame time. So it's nice to see a native PS5 emulator for these older games. Now, considering the fact that Implicit Conversions kind of went through the work to make these multiple emulators for the PS5 and they ended up being pretty decent, a lot of people have been asking them like, hey, could you guys be the ones to actually put the time and effort in to get a PS3 emulator up and running? And they answered. They said, this is something that we're dreaming up right now. It's going to take a lot of work to actually get it built from the ground up, but it is something that they're actively working on, which is great because the rumors of them working on the PS2 emulator for the PS5, the turnaround time on it being a thing that they just started working on and then released with new games in the PS catalog collection was very short. So I understand that this could take a long time, but they clearly have some knowledge and expertise into building out emulators, and it's something that I would really like to see. You know, maybe it's just a thing at Sony where they just have limited resources right now because game sales are going down. You know, a lot of companies are closing their doors, whether it's developers or even some publishers. Everyone's pinching pennies a little bit tighter right now because things are so expensive, and they're looking at the bare essentials when it comes to what they need to spend money on. R&D of games, R&D of the PlayStation 6, that covers all of their potential budget for the year, so they don't have extra time and money to put into building out a PS3 emulator. And I understand that because this generation has been weird. They had to spend a lot of time actually manufacturing these things, figuring out how to reduce the size and scale of them so that they can make money on the console. Like, because of everything that happened in 2020, you know, it was a lot more difficult on the company end, and it's the only time where I really feel sympathy for Sony because they were put in a weird spot. But with all that being said, they've got a great company just sitting there where their whole brand and like thing that they do is build emulators for the PlayStation 5 so that they can convert games to run on the PS5 and make money from PS Plus catalog collections and also individual game sales. So if they're going to put in the time and energy to do this, I feel like it would be a lot cheaper for Sony to just pay them to do it instead of doing everything in-house and wasting their excellent engineering team who could be better served working on stuff like the PS5 Pro, fixing PSSR, and of course eventually the PS6 and the PlayStation handheld. I know a lot of people who watch this channel are younger and probably wouldn't even bother playing a lot of these older games, but I also know a lot of people who watch this channel are my age or even a little bit older who grew up with these great first-party PlayStation games that were really focused on fun and breaking the mold and actually pushing boundaries in terms of graphics and gameplay. All these great games we have right now, like Spider-Man 2, Ghost of Tsushima, and The Last of Us Part 2, and eventually Intergalactic and Ghost of Yotei, all of those were built upon great games like Resistance and stuff like Ratchet and Clank and stuff like, I don't know, Uncharted, which was amazing. And I don't understand why they let that franchise go away while God of War figured out how to continue on into 2 generations later. It's crazy. And a lot of these great PlayStation first party games that I always talk about, like Resistance, like Killzone, like SOCOM, a lot of these games were never released on PC. Sony didn't start releasing their games on other platforms until well into the PS4 generation or early in the PS5 generation. So they're kind of just sitting there collecting dust, and they're not doing the great collections they used to do during the PS3 days where you could get a triple pack of God of War 1 and 2, Chains of Olympus and Ghost of Sparta, or Jack 1, 2, and 3, or, you know, Sly Cooper 1, 2, and 3 in a $40 package with upscale graphics. They used to release those left and right during the PS3 generation, and they just haven't. They've only been remastering and remaking PS4 games that you can buy for a $10 upgrade. Like, there's this whole generation of amazing games that's just sitting there, and they have a great opportunity with implicit conversions to actually make this emulator happen. I hope it really does come to fruition. We'll just have to wait and see though, but I am excited. Now is the time, right? Like the PS5 is out, the PS5 Pro is out. They're obviously working on the PS6 and the eventual handheld. Like now is the time to start working on those things you put on the back burner, like PS3 emulation. It's how you keep the hype going for the PS5. And I'm sure there's a lot of people stuck on PS4 who ironically would be tempted to finally upgrade to the PS5 or PS5 Pro if they knew they could play PS3 games, 2-generation old games. I know, but it's true. A lot of people would upgrade for those. Anyway, that brings me to the second news topic here, which is legit. Like it's a really weird way that you can get a free PS5. So what we're talking about, I'm gonna have to be careful, is weapon buyback. So the weapon I'm talking about is the kind that you would use in Grand Theft Auto. So you kind of got the idea of what I'm talking about. And in Louisiana, I guess specifically New Orleans, a church set up this program where you could bring your weapons to the church and give them to the police, and they would dismantle them. And then in return for that, instead of getting money, you would get an actual free PS5. And I was reading about this, and I guess some lady had a full concealed carry permit, and she had a
C4 Corvette.
Well, I just got demonetized. I guess I'll beep it, but she had a
C4 Corvette.
She brought it to this church and she said, hey, I have a concealed carry. I know how to use my
C4 Corvette
for safety, but you know, my kids are young. They want a PS5. I don't have a lot of extra money lying around, and
C4 Corvette
is actually worth less than a PS5. So she traded in her
C4 Corvette
and got a PS5 in return. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole 2A argument here. You know,
car
buybacks are very controversial. I understand that, but this is kind of a cool program, right? Like if you've got extra weapons lying around, which I'm sure a lot of people do because there's more weapons than people in the United States, giving people a PS5 in return for that instead of less money than the weapon is worth is kind of like the smartest buyback system I've ever heard of. And I know there's a lot of people out there who would actually take advantage of it. I don't want to pass judgment and say if it's good or bad, because you got to take these things at a case-by-case basis. Like, yeah, that lady who had her concealed carry and had
GT3 RS,
but her kids wanted a PS5, it worked for her. As long as they're not forcing people, saying, you know, give me your
Roxy
and I'll give you a PS5 and you have no choice. I think it's like a fine system. But I don't know, if you've been wanting a PS5 and you've been living in New Orleans, look up this church and see if they do it again. It seems like it was successful for them. They got their intended goal. Like I saw they got something like 300 different weapons that they were able to dismantle. Could be a good way to get a free PS5 if you're one of those 50% of people who are still stuck on the PS4. That is definitely the craziest news story I've ever had on PSReady, like 100%, but it happened and it worked. So like, you know, I figured I should let my New Orleans viewers know that they can get a free PS5 without passing judgment on the entire system. I think I handled it right. Anyway, that brings me to the third news story here, which is all about Arrowhead. So these guys have been connected to Sony for a long time, right? Like Helldivers 1 came out during the PS3 and Vita days, and I was an early adopter of Helldivers, and I thought it was really cool. I got all my friends to play it with me, and we thought it was great. Then Helldivers 2 was like a completely different story in terms of being a bigger, better version of it, but actually being one of the best, if not the best extraction shooter you can play on console right now. They had a little bit of a dip, partially thanks to Sony requiring people to sign into the PSN on PC. Also, you know, it was brutally difficult to the point where it wasn't fun, and they started nerfing weapons when people felt like they were already at the brink of difficulty, and then they reverted all that and made guns better. And now the game's in a great spot with Killzone in the game, and it's excellent. But the reason I'm talking about them today is that their COO came out and said that they're already working on their next game. And it really just got me thinking that this studio fits the mold in terms of studios that Sony traditionally buys. You know, what they do is they make second-party games where Sony owns the IP, like with Helldivers or with Ratchet and Clank or Sly Cooper or Jak and Daxter. They let them make these games, they fund the games, and if they sell well and do well critically, Sony then buys the studio. And I can't think of a better opportunity to pick up a great studio than with Arrowhead, because they kind of did the impossible. They had a console exclusive live service game. It was on PC, but it wasn't on Nintendo Switch, it wasn't on Xbox, and it was extremely successful. And now, almost a year later, it still is extremely successful. And if they are working on another game, they just got a huge influx of cash from Helldivers 2, and they probably could afford to not have Sony bankroll their next game, which would not keep it exclusive to the PlayStation 5. And I think that would suck. I think the PlayStation brand kind of added to the fact that Helldivers 2 took off. It had that Sony label, that Sony endorsement on it, and now Helldivers is associated with Sony, and we've seen them in the past with brands brands like Crash Bandicoot, where these games, or Metal Gear Solid, for example, these games are connected to Sony, and then they let the developer or the publisher kind of slip through their fingers, and then eventually their games end up on every other system, and they've lost a potential system seller. So if there's a time to buy Arrowhead, I think it is right now. I know people get testy about the acquisition stuff, but the other publishers like Microsoft and Nintendo, they're not stopping, right? Like, just because Sony might think it's not great to buy up every studio in the world, clearly Microsoft doesn't feel that way, because they are buying up as many studios as they possibly can. And if they bought Arrowhead, the next game, whether it's Helldivers 3 or something completely new, would definitely end up on PlayStation, because Xbox can't afford to make it exclusive to Xbox and PC, but then they'd get all the 30% cut from every game sale and every digital sale with microtransactions and war bonds and everything like that. And I just think it'd be better for Sony as a whole to have that money. Like, Helldivers clearly works as an IP. It was underestimated by Sony, and if their next game is Helldivers 3, they have a prime opportunity to kind of not have to rely so heavily on Bungie to kind of save them with one big hit live service game. Like, just because Helldivers 2 is a smaller live service that they're selling for less than full price doesn't mean that Helldivers 3 can't be that much bigger and better, to the point where it is that money-making game that somehow straddles the fence between being consumer friendly and exactly what your gamers want, while also generating income behind the scenes that can then fund single player games. So if there is any candidate for Sony to pick up that makes a lot of sense right now, I think it's Arrowhead. I don't know if they'd want to be sold. I'm sure they wouldn't, because of where they're sitting with cash right now, but it only takes one bomb these days for your entire studio to be shut down. And I think Arrowhead would really benefit from the security of being owned by Sony for their next game. But I don't know, I could be crazy. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you in today's video. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.